I'm really happy to introduce Professor Martine Robbeets to you guys. Martine is a research group leader of the Archaeolinguistic research group at the MPI, and she's also an honorary professor at the Department of General and Comparative Linguistics at the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz. She holds a PhD in comparative linguistics from the University of Leiden, and she recently finalized an interdisciplinary project on the dispersal of Trans-Eurasian Languages, funded by an ERC consolidator grant. She wrote several monographs and edited various volumes, among which the Oxford Guide to Trans-Eurasian Languages. And today she'll be presenting to you Archaeolinguistics, the Trans-Eurasian case, which will be our first example of how you can combine these three different fields together. So I'm really excited to hear about it.
So thank you very much for your nice introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, linguists, archaeologists, geneticists, welcome to this course in archaeolinguistics. Archaeolinguistics is the study of linguistic prehistory, integrating linguistics and archaeology in a single approach to reconstruct various aspects of the human past. And with the recent advances in the ancient DNA, archaeolinguistics is certainly not restricted to this interface between archaeology and linguistics, but it is also increasingly interacting with genetics. Over the last decade, the triangulation of these three disciplines has been revolutionizing our view of human prehistory. In my course today, then I would like to explore the field of archaeolinguistics and then apply these archaeolinguistic tools to the case of Trans-Eurasian. So this course will consist of 5 parts. In part 1, I will introduce the field of archaeolinguistics. What is archaeolinguistics? In part 2, we will zoom in on the genealogical relatedness of the so-called Trans-Eurasian languages. The question, are Japanese, Korean, Tungusic, Mongolic, and Turkic languages related? And then in part 3, we will see what linguists and archaeologists and geneticists individually can tell about Trans-Eurasian. And then in the fourth part, I would like to bring together the different lines of evidence to map them on each other. The question there will be, how does the interdisciplinary evidence match or mismatch? Are there similarities? Are there discrepancies? And then fifth, I would like to say a few words on the challenges that confront us when we apply archaeolinguistics in the real world, that is beyond theoretical issues. So in March this year, our Eurasia Triangle project came to an end. Our Eurasia Triangle project was a project on the topic of millets and beans, language and genes, the dispersal of the Trans-Eurasian languages. And it was hosted at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena. In our previous team, we had 2 archaeologists, 3 geneticists, and the other people were linguists. And then when the group came to an end, when the ERC Consolidators grant came to an end, we were offered a new archaeolinguistic research group by the Max Planck president. So this group allows us to further explore the different archaeolinguistic tools and to apply them on the case of the languages in North and East Asia, the Trans-Eurasian languages in particular. And we are still situated here at the Max Planck Institute in Jena. So let us move then to part one. What is archaeolinguistics? Well, archaeolinguistics is the archaeology of language, the study of linguistic prehistory, integrating genetics, archaeology, and linguistics. And archaeo in archaeolinguistics means ancient. Archaeolinguists can go back to ancient times, that is long before the appearance of the first written records of a language. So we can reconstruct an ancestral stage to a language from which different daughter languages, a group of related languages, descended. So conventionally, this ancestral state is called a proto-language. This language may be separated by centuries or even millennia from the first written attestations of the languages. So using the historical comparative linguistic method, it is possible to reconstruct this ancestral stage by undoing systematic changes that led to regular correspondences among the attested languages. And the textbook market for historical linguistics and linguistic reconstruction is today livelier probably than it has ever been. But a good old classic that can introduce you in historical linguistic reconstruction is this introduction by Lyle Campbell, already in its third edition. So it's a very accessible book, accessible to non-linguists and beginning students. And it also gives you many examples how to reconstruct from an Indo-European and Mesoamerican and other Uralic languages. Once the archaeolinguists have reconstructed a proto-vocabulary, they can also try to determine the proto-culture that is revealed in that proto-vocabulary. So archaeolinguists try to reconstruct the natural and cultural environment of the ancestral speakers. So the basic assumption is that if the ancestral speakers had words for, say, textile technology, or for crops, or for stone tools, or animal husbandry, fauna and flora, and daring, that they were probably also familiar with these practices and these concepts. There are no real books on cultural reconstruction, but there is this Routledge Handbook of Historical Linguistics that the editors call the New Historical Linguistics, and it includes 2 chapters on cultural reconstruction. So one is by Patience Epps, a general introduction to what is cultural reconstruction, and another is one by Paul Hegarty, who takes a more critical attitude towards this cultural reconstruction. So this is also something that I could advise if you want to know more about cultural reconstruction. And then third, archaeolinguists also reconstruct with whom the ancestral speakers were in contact. So throughout prehistoric times, words have traveled, naming new ideas, new practices, and new concepts. And archaeolinguists study the ways that in which ancestral languages influenced each other when their speakers interacted. So linguistic borrowing is closely linked with cultural diffusion. When we find out more about how a word was borrowed between 2 ancestral communities, we can also get an understanding of how the concepts and the practices traveled through prehistory. However, as Rasmus already noticed yesterday in his course on loanwords, language contact phenomena are not restricted to loanwords alone. General structural features, yes, no features of language can also diffuse. And that brings us a bit with Hedwig's course on typology, where she showed general structural features like vowel harmony, or like the collexification of hand and arm, or like word order, SOV order. These things can also diffuse between languages. There is no real book on language contact in prehistory on the textbook market, but a good introduction to language contact in general is this Handbook of Language Contact by Raymond Hickey. I think there's a real gap for somebody who might write a book on language contact in prehistory. And I hope that our doctoral researcher connected to our project, Rasmus Bjorn, may do that at one point in his career. So he was discussing loanwords yesterday. And then the day before yesterday, we had Hedwig talking about typology. Typological features can thus also diffuse and also belong to this area of language contact. And then fourth, archaeolinguists also built language trees that visualize how an ancient speech community broke up and dispersed across time and space. To this end, there are different methods. We divide the methods into distance-based methods like lexicostatistics and automatic similarity judgment program, but there are also character-based methods like maximum parsimony and Bayesian phylogenetics. These character-based methods are considered to be the most efficient ones lately. The maximum parsimony method is the basic method used by classical historical comparative linguists. And it is a method that seeks for a tree that explains the data by minimizing the number of evolutionary changes that yield the data. On the other hand, the Bayesian phylogenetic method is this set of methods introduced over the last decades to linguistics from molecular anthropology and biology. And these methods seek for the tree that explains the data by quantifying how likely it is that the data have been produced by a certain model. So different techniques for building language trees. In the same Routledge Handbook of Historical Linguistics, there is a chapter by Michael Dunn on language phylogenies, which I find a good introduction on the topic because it does not only focus on Bayesian phylogenies, but also gives a clear introduction on how the other phylogenetic methods work. And of course, also within this summer school, you will have the chance to listen to Annika Tjuka and her colleagues who will introduce you in Bayesian phylogenies. And then fifth, archaeolinguists also date nodes in the language trees. And the fact that linguists do dates, that they can date, is very important, especially crucial when we want to bring our findings together with archaeological findings and genetic findings, because all these fields do dates. there are a number of methods for dating nodes in the language trees. The most frequently used ones and efficient ones are, again, the Bayesian methods. In the Bayesian method, we use language divergence over tested time spans to calibrate. And the Bayesian method also gives you a time depth and quantifies how likely it is that it falls within a certain credibility interval. Cultural reconstruction is a classical method for linguistic dating, and that gives you a time frame in which the reconstructed vocabulary items were available to the speakers of the proto-language. A nice introduction to dating is a review article by Gray, Atkinson, and Greenhill, Language Evolution and Human History, What the Difference a Date Makes. What is good about the article is that it does not only focus on computational dating techniques, but also mentions the classical ones, and it gives a kind of a general overview. And then archaeolinguists can also locate ancestral speech communities in space. And for this, they use different methods, such as the diversity hotspot method, cultural reconstruction, and then more recently, also Bayesian phylogeography. The diversity hotspot method is a method that places the homeland there where we find the greatest diversity with regard to the deepest subgroups in the language tree, while cultural reconstruction sets up or delimits an area where reconstructed items, plants, animals, cultural items are found to the exclusion of other regions. And then more recently, we see also Bayesian phylogeography, which models language expansion over time using a phylogenetic tree as a backbone, and also giving a kind of, or using a distribution rate at which languages change location. Just very recently, two articles have appeared testing different methods of linguistic homeland detection. One is by Richman and Tarakarama, which just appeared in March, and another is by Balthazar Bickel and his group from Zurich, and that article focuses more on Bayesian phylogeography. You will have the chance to hear Balthazar Bickel, I think, next week. He will give a talk within this summer course, and he will probably also mention this homeland detection. And then finally, what do archaeolinguists do? They also bring together the evidence of linguistics with that of archaeology and genetics. So archaeolinguists can determine a place, a time, migratory dynamics, and the kind of cultural and natural environment for the speakers of the proto-language. And independently, archaeologists and geneticists can determine variables for values such as time and space, but also migratory dynamics for the cultures and the people, the populations which form the object of their study. And then aligning these different lines of evidence, mapping them on each other, we can point out discrepancies and correlations between the evidence. And in this way, mapping linguistic expansion on cultural diffusion, on population migration, we can get a more balanced view of human prehistory than each of these disciplines can provide us with individually. So all good or well for the archaeolinguistic tools. We can now try to apply these tools on the Trans-Eurasian case. And that brings us to part 2, how to show that Japanese, Korean, Tungusic, Mongolic, and Turkic are related. We use this term, the Trans-Eurasian Languages, in reference to this large group of geographically adjacent languages, reaching from the Pacific in the east to the Baltic, the Mediterranean, and the Black Sea in the west, and including up to 5 different uncontroversial linguistic families. That is the Turkic languages here in green. When we speak of Turkic languages, we do not only refer to Turkish, but to a whole group of about 20 different languages that are spoken across Eurasia. And then we have a group of Mongolic languages in blue, not only Khalkha Mongolian, as they speak it in the Mongolian Republic, but also different Mongolic languages spoken in Russia and China. And then we have a group of Tungusic languages. These are the little red spots that you see here on the map. Most of these languages are nearly extinct or endangered languages, and they form a Tungusic family. There's also one here, Shibe in Xinjiang, which is a kind of descendant of the Manchu language. And then we have the Koreanic languages. Today, there's actually only one Korean language. Some people would call the dialect of Jeju also a language, but that's still debated whether that's a dialect or a language. And then we have the Japonic languages, that is mainland Japanese as we know it. But then there are also different, at least 5 different Ryukyuan languages here spoken on the Ryukyus. The very question of whether these 5 different branches go back to one single common ancestral language is one of the most disputed questions of archaeolinguistics. The main objections raised against the genealogical relatedness of these languages are first that there is no basic vocabulary in common, that there are no regular sound correspondences, no common morphology, and that similarities are not borrowing proof. That means that they can better be explained by borrowing than that they can be explained by going back to a common ancestor by inheritance. These were the reservations expressed by Stefan Georg and his colleagues in an article at the turn of this millennium, and these objections are still voiced by a number of linguists today. For instance, Glottolog, which is an online catalog of the world's language families, does not give Trans-Eurasian as a valid genealogical grouping. So today I would like to summarize why I think that the current present-day state of the debate has advanced beyond the state of the debate in 1998, and that the Glottolog position is perhaps not entirely in line with the current availability of the evidence. First, speaking of evidence, we should speak of a basic vocabulary. In Annika's class, you were asked to give 5 basic vocabulary items, and this basic vocabulary list is actually a compilation of concepts that are relatively culture-free, that are relatively universal across the different languages of the world, and that are also relatively resistant to borrowing. For the Trans-Eurasian languages, so I researched this list of Leipzig-Jakarta, this Leipzig-Jakarta 100 list, so 100 basic vocabulary items. And we find that there are 93 etymologies for 64 concepts of this basic vocabulary list relating the Trans-Eurasian languages. So Japonic, Koreanic, Tungusic, Mongolic, and Turkic. Here I give 8 examples, the etymologies for house, leg, foot, to bite, what, to burn, not, white, and hard. And when we say that there are etymologies, we also mean that the cognates are well distributed. That means that we do not find a single cognate in one language of the subfamily, but that the cognates are really well distributed within each family. For Japonic, for instance, we find this word kata, heart, for instance, not only in contemporary Japanese J or Old Japanese OJ, but also in all the Ryukyuan dialects. For Korean, it's well distributed. We find it in contemporary, in Middle Korean. In the Mongolic languages, we have it in Written Mongolian and Middle Mongolic, older ancient stages of the language, and also in the contemporary Mongolic languages. For Turkic, we find the words here, kat, bihar, not only in Old Turkic, but also in contemporary Turkic languages, including Chuvash, which is the only surviving Western Turkic language. In the last column here of the etymology for kata, you see numbers for sound correspondences. So this implies that each of the basic vocabulary items displays regular sound correspondences. That means that their initial consonant, medial vowel, and medial consonant of the words all correspond regularly. So correspondence number 13 is this red correspondence for the initial K. Then we have a green correspondence for the medial A, and then we have one here in blue for the medial consonant T. So if all subsequent phonemes of a word correspond regularly, they are considered a good cognate pair, good evidence. So this gray shading means that at least 3 subsequent phonemes of the root are corresponding regularly. So these correspondence, so we have lists of correspondences for the consonants between Japonic, Koreanic, Tungusic, Mongolic, and Turkic. You here see the blue correspondence and the red correspondence relevant for the example of kata. And the list of consonant correspondences continues, and then there are also vowel correspondences. So all basic etymologies answer to the correspondences that are given here for at least 3 subsequent phonemes. In addition to basic vocabulary and regular sound correspondences, we also need morphology to be shared in order to demonstrate that languages are related. Morphology, that are the little building stones of words that give words a function in the sentence or that derive new words. In my book on the diachrony of verb morphology in Japanese. Oh, okay. There was like sound interrupting, but now everybody is muted again, I think. So I was speaking about my book on the diachrony of verb morphology, where I proposed 20 verb suffixes that relate the Trans-Eurasian languages. I do not wish to go into the whole etymology here in detail, but it's just one example of such a of these building stones that also correspond. So here we reconstruct Ka for a resultative nominalizer, it is interesting to see that it's not only the form ha and the function resultative nominalizer correspond, but that there's also a peculiarity corresponding, namely the fact that ha turns into ka after an r or an n. And that is true not for one branch, but for 3 branches of the language families. Such sharing of irregularities is very important because it is strong evidence for the genealogical relatedness of the languages concerned. So, but in the end, I think that not a single linguist would disagree that Japanese, Korean, Tungusic, Mongolic, and Turkic share a lot of similarities. The question is not whether they share similarities or not, but the question is rather what explains the similarities. Are all the similarities caused by borrowing, or are some similarities perhaps the result of inheritance, residue of inheritance from a common ancestor? So borrowing, that is what scientists would call horizontal transmission, is the unidirectional transfer from a form of from one language into another. So for instance, here in the example, we have the Dutch word for beer that in the 18th century was borrowed into Japanese as biru. So nobody would say that these words go back to a common ancestral word between Dutch and Japanese. It's just like a unidirectional horizontal transfer. Cognacy, on the other hand, is vertical transmission. It is descent from a common ancestral word. Like we find here, English, German, and Dutch have cognate words for beer that go back on to an ancestral word in Proto-Germanic. As for Trans-Eurasian evidence, at least the evidence that we discussed today, I think that this evidence is relatively copy-proof. That means it's probably not due to borrowing for a number of reasons. First of all, because basic vocabulary and verb morphology belong to the most stable parts of language, and they are very resistant to borrowing to begin with. And we have a big amount of basic vocabulary and verb morphology shared between these Trans-Eurasian languages. Next, in our basic vocabulary, we see that there is 75% of verbs and 70% of grammatical items etymologized, while only 50% of the nouns are. And this is in contradiction with the classical borrowing hierarchy. We know that if languages borrow from each other, it is easier to borrow nouns than verbs, and it is easier to borrow words, lexicon, than it is to borrow grammar. And yet here, the hierarchy is opposite. So this also contradicts borrowing. Then we find the regularity and the complexity of sound correspondence. And we also pointed to the solid distribution in a multiple setting. Usually when languages borrow from each other, you will see that it will go from one language, a donor language, into another, a recipient language. So there will be some kind of a binary setting. Examples where the same word goes in a third, fourth, fifth, sixth language are available, but they are rather rare, and especially for verbs and for grammatical items, it is rare that they cross many different linguistic boundaries. And that is exactly what we find in the Trans-Eurasian case, that it are especially the verbs and the grammatical items that are attested over at least over the 5 branches. So that is why, in a nutshell, why I think that our evidence is relatively copy-proof, and that it is more sensible to explain some of the correspondences by inheritance than it is to explain everything by borrowing. So back to our main objections, we do find basic vocabulary, we do find regular sound correspondences, there is common morphology, and the evidence is relatively borrowing proof. So I think that there is a small core of reliable evidence relating the Trans-Eurasian languages as a valid genealogical grouping. But accepting the Trans-Eurasian unity as a valid genealogical grouping raises new questions, such as who were the speakers of Trans-Eurasian? Where did they live? When did they live? When did they move? Where did they move? And why did they move? And these questions cannot easily be answered using linguistics alone. No, we have to address different disciplines, such as archaeology and genetics. And that is also why the key objective of my archaeolinguistic research group is to integrate these different perspectives in a single approach. In the linguistic part of our project, we have collected a big database for 98 Trans-Eurasian languages, including present-day varieties and older varieties. And we collected basic vocabulary as well as agro-pastoral vocabulary. We applied Bayesian phylogenetic methods to our data set, and this resulted in this dated tree. So we find that our Proto-Trans-Eurasian ancestor, which was spoken about 9,000 years ago, first split into a Japano-Koreanic group and an Altaic group. Altaic, that is a unity of Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungusic. And from these Altaic languages, Turkic was the first to split off. We also applied Bayesian phylogeography on our languages, and we found that it nicely converged with the results of more classical methods such as diversity hotspot principle and cultural reconstruction. We situated the homeland of Proto-Trans-Eurasian here in northeast China in the West Liao River area. And from there, first Proto-Trans-Eurasian split into Altaic and Japano-Koreanic. And then Turkic was the first to split off from Altaic and to break away into the eastern steppe. Then Koreanic left from here and went to the south of the Korean peninsula. And then finally, Tungusic left to the Russian Far East. Proto-Japonic went over the Korean peninsula to Kyushu on Japan, and from there it spread then over mainland Japan and the Ryukyus. In addition to phylogeography, we also did cultural reconstruction. So we searched for etymologies that could tell us something about the cultural and the natural environment of the speakers of Proto-Trans-Eurasian. And we find etymologies that suggest that our Proto-Trans-Eurasian speakers had words for agriculture, such as field for cultivation. The crops we can reconstruct are only millets, so we find broom corn millet and barnyard millet. We cannot reconstruct any rice vocabulary or any vocabulary for secondary crops like barley and wheat, only millets. And then there are also a number of verbs that seem to refer to fermentation, like the verb to ferment or to preserve by fermentation. And finally, we also find some specialized technological vocabulary relating to textile technology. such as, for instance, a verb for to spin. It's not only the linguistics, the words, the action of spinning that is corresponding, but we also found that spindle whorls nicely correspond between the West Liao, Primorje, Korea, and Japan, the homelands of our individual families. And then we also have a weaving verb, which is illustrated here. So that's spinning and weaving. So basically, we can say that our speakers of Proto-Trans-Eurasian were sedentary. They practiced millet agriculture. They preserved food by fermentation, and they also engaged in complex textile technology. From the absence of evidence, we think that they did not practice rice agriculture, and there was no barley or wheat agriculture. They did not have any dairying, nor did they have pastoralism. When we look at rice vocabulary, for instance, we see that it enters these languages much later, when they have already separated. That is in the late Neolithic and the Bronze Age. There is, for instance, this etymology for rice, suggesting that rice was a wonder word, this kind of traveling loan word, which Rasmus referred to yesterday, wandering from Semitic into a daughter language of Proto-Austronesian into Japonic. And this borrowing of rice can probably be situated in a context whereby Japonic and Austronesian were neighbors when they were still situated on the Shandong Peninsula. In the late Bronze Age, we see other evidence for crops being borrowed from west to east. For instance, barley and wheat seems to have been transferred, if not from Indo-European, then from a kind of substratum that is also present in a number of European languages, from there into Proto-Tibeto-Burman, Old Chinese, and Tungusic, and from Tungusic independently in Koreanic and Japonic. And also terms relating to pastoralism, like the word here for horse, have traveled from west to east, like Marco horse in Indo-European, related to our word for mare or mere in German, borrowed in Tibeto-Burman, Chinese, and from there individually in Koreanic, Japonic, and Mongolic. So this gives us an idea about the linguistic perspective, that is, where was our language, where was the ancestral language located, what was its time depth, what were the migratory dynamics, and what were the subsistence patterns. But how can we now successfully interact with geneticists and archaeologists? And the basic idea or the basic logic that underlies our research group is that first, each discipline should carry out its data collection and its analysis independently. And that is to avoid circularity in the argumentation. So our geneticists go into the field independently with their own toolkit, and they collect their own data and analyze these data with their own methods. And so do the archaeologists. They go into the field and apply their archaeological tools on their data sets. So here you see, for instance, our archaeologist Mark Hudson at his site on the southern Ryukyus, Nagabaka, on Miyako Island, and our geneticist Ning Chao, more or less incognito, here on the Banlashan site in Liaoning, and here on his on the site of the Yellow River. And this is Chung Won-jong, a geneticist with whom I went to Korea to sample a petrous bone of this Bronze Age Korean individual. So in the archaeological part of our project, our archaeologists compiled a big database of 255 different Neolithic and Bronze Age sites. And in addition, they also compiled a database of serial remains with direct radiocarbon datings. On this map, you see that the Neolithic sites are here indicated in red, and the Bronze Age sites are all numbered with green numbers. We then also use this Bayesian methods, Bayesian statistics, and we try to infer a tree of archaeological sites. And these, the branches of this tree thus can be interpreted as clusters of cultural similarity. And we found the first cluster of similar cultures among the early Neolithic cultures of the Westlia River region, which are here indicated in red. And those branch first into a Korean Chumun branch and a Amharic and Liaodong branch. So this nicely corresponds with the current knowledge that millet dispersed from the Westlia River region first to the Korean peninsula around 6,500 BP, and then later around 5,000 BP took a northern route towards the Russian Far East, the Primoria. And then there's a second cluster, which you see here in green, that starts from some Neolithic and Bronze Age cultures in the Westlia River area in dark green, that are the cultures that you see here. And then there seems to be a split between the Chumun, between the Mumun cultures on the Korean peninsula, and the Japonic cultures, the Japanese cultures. This is nicely paralleled with what we know about the expansion route of rice agriculture. Rice was added to the millet agricultural package here in the Liaodong-Shandong interaction sphere. And then around 3,500 BP in the Bronze Age, it traveled to Korea. And from the southern tip of the Korean peninsula, it was transmitted to Japan around 3,000 BP. And then we have our geneticists or the geneticists in our project sampled ancient DNA. So we took new samples from several regions in Northeast Asia, including here the Amur region, the Westlia River region, Korea, and Japan. And we combined them with pre-existing samples from the eastern steppe, the Yellow River region, and the Primoria. Our samples range from early Neolithic, 9,000 BP, to the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. So the Neolithic samples are here marked in different tones of red on the map, and the Bronze Age samples are marked in green. Our geneticists then plotted these ancient samples on a PCA of modern Eurasian populations. They found that the very early hunter-gatherers of Northeast Asia, here marked in wine red, and the earliest farmers of the Westlia River region, here marked in red, and also the people from the Amur region here in pink, all plot on top of the present-day Tungusic speakers. So this cluster of ancestry is called the Amur-like component, or Amur-like ancestry. It is interesting to see that Amur-like ancestry today is not only present in these Tungusic people who are here marked in yellow, present-day Tungusic on the map, but also in present-day Mongolic, who are marked in orange on the map, and also to a certain extent in present-day Turkic in gray on the map, be it with varying degrees of east-west admixture. So the Turkic people underwent much Western Eurasian admixture. And this Amur-like ancestry is also present in Japanese and Korean speakers, which makes of this Amur component a kind of common component shared by all speakers of Trans-Eurasian languages. And then focusing on Korea and Japan, we were the first to report ancient genomes from the Korean Peninsula. Surprisingly, we found that some of the Korean genomes in the late Neolithic looked a lot like, they had a lot of blue, so they looked a lot like Japanese Jomon genomes. But in general, our middle Neolithic Korean genomes were a combination of Jomon ancestry here in blue with Hongshan ancestry. And Hongshan ancestry, that is the genetic profile of the people living here in the Westliao River area. So this suggests a gene flow from the Westliao River area into the Korean Peninsula that was probably accompanied by millet, by the introduction of millet farming. And then there seems to be genetic turnover on the Korean Peninsula, because in the Bronze Age we get a different genome that can best be modeled as Upper Shajajen genome. And this Upper Shajajen people were also people here living in the Westliao River region in the Bronze Age. So this suggests a second wave of gene flow from this northeast Chinese region into Korea in the Bronze Age. And then we see that the Korean Bronze Age genome looks a lot like the Japanese Bronze Age genome, suggesting a massive migration from Korea to Japan in the Bronze Age. So on Japan, we see a near genetic turnover from underlying Jomon genes to these new incoming Yayoi genes, these genes that can be associated with the income of farming and probably also with the introduction of the Japonic language to Japan. So this brings us to part 4. How does the interdisciplinary evidence match or mismatch? Just in a nutshell, the situation before 9000 BP was such that in the Westliao River area we found the Proto-Trans-Eurasian family, and in the Yellow River area we find a Sino-Tibetan language family. And it is interesting to see how these linguistic homelands nicely map on the domestication centers for millets in Northeast Asia. So we have one domestication center in the Westliao River area and another one in the Yellow River area. So it seems they can be associated with these two language families. And interestingly, we have also a large Amur gene pool in the northern area, and here a Yellow River-like ancestry more to the south. Then in the period between 9000 and 5500 BP, we see that Trans-Eurasian splits into an Altaic branch and a Japano-Koreanic branch. In our farming, we see that the farming area remains more or less the same, but in this period we see a steady population growth, and this could lead to social distancing between people speaking Altaic and Japano-Koreanic, so a kind of broken connectivity between the speakers of Altaic and Japano-Koreanic. And then we move to the period between 5500 and 4000 BP. There we see that Proto-Koreanic is the first to split off and to move over the Liaodong Peninsula to the Korean Peninsula. And then about a millennium later, Proto-Tungusic splits off and moves to the Russian Far East. And interestingly, this maps again very neatly on our dispersal of millets. We see that first millets agriculture moves over the Liaodong Peninsula to the southern tip of the Korean Peninsula, and that then in the same time, in 4500 BP, it moves to the Russian Far East. So it is very attractive, or it seems that this Proto-Tungusic language expansion can be associated with the millet expansion, while the Koreanic expansion can also be associated with the earlier millet expansion. In the genes, we see a supporting evolution, namely that our middle Neolithic Koreans, the Changhan, show genetic mixture between Jomon genes and these Hongshan genes, deriving them from the West Liao River area. So in this time, also there was also a population migration going from this West Liao River area to Korea, nicely corresponding with the millets moving and with the language moving. And then in the final period between 4000 and 2500 BP, we see that there is a lot of interaction and borrowing going on, and that Japonic finally moves over the Korean Peninsula to reach Kyushu around 3000 BP. And here is a picture for the millets, but if we add also rice and barley and wheat, we see that from this Shandong-Liaodong interaction sphere, this rice agricultural package moves to Korea, and from there to Kyushu, Japan, similar to the way of the language. And also in the genes, we find evidence for massive migration from Korea to Japan, and we also see that these Korean genes reflect a second influx of genes from the West Liao River area that can probably associate it with the introduction of rice agriculture. So just in a summary, we derive or we think that the origins of the Trans-Eurasian languages go back to the beginnings of millet agriculture in Northeast Asia and to the early days of the Amur gene pool. So the Trans-Eurasian language dispersals went in two phases. The first phase is here indicated in red. It is the separation of Koreanic going to Korea and of Tungusic going to the Russian Far East, which can be associated with the expansion of millet agriculture and with the further spread of Amur genome. And then the second phase is the phase of the Bronze Age, when there was a lot of contact going on between separate Trans-Eurasian and non-Trans-Eurasian languages, like Sino-Tibetan language, a lot of borrowing, leading to the integration of rice agriculture in the millet agricultural package. And rice went from the Shandong-Liaodong interaction sphere to Korea, to Japan, where, and of course, in addition to rice agriculture, it led to kind of a mixture between Jomon genes and Northeast Chinese and Korean genes, and also to the introduction of the Japonic language to Japan. So in this way, you see how we can integrate these different disciplines into one, into a single approach of the human past. So in this archaeolinguistic approach, you could say, provides not only a doorway to a human prehistory, but perhaps also a cycle gate to human prehistory. I here pictured a tandem with geneticists, linguists, and archaeologists working together. And indeed, this collaboration has really been our kind of tour de France. It has been very intensive and involved, or research involved at least 10 collaborators over a period of 5 years. So the results that I present you here today are really generated over this long period, a kind of real odyssey. We, together with our team, we published more than 100 publications over the last years. You can check those publications on our EurasiaTriangle.com website, and then there is also a more restricted web page for our Archaeolinguistic Research Group on the Max Planck Institute in Jena website. Among these 100 publications, you also find the 2 publications that I proposed for this course as readings or as background literature. There is this Oxford Guide to Trans-Eurasian Languages, which I edited together with our postdoctoral researcher Alexander Savelyev, giving you insights not only in the linguistics of Trans-Eurasian, but there are also quite some interdisciplinary approaches there, including archaeology, anthropology, and genetics. And then we have recently submitted an article to Nature that has been under extensive review, and we hope that it will be accepted soon, of course. It is now in the Nature portfolio, which you can also check online. So when you look at that, it may seem to you that we made progress and that our progress went into a straight line upward. That is often what people think about progress when they look at it from a distance. In reality, and you will probably confirm that when you are working on your MA dissertation or your PhD dissertation, progress is more something like this. So this is more what it really looks like. It never went in one straight upward line. Indeed, there were many challenges in our interdisciplinary research, and these challenges went far beyond methodology or theory. So it was not only about how to put the different disciplines together, but there were other practical problems, like, for instance, reconciling the different research tradition in each discipline: genetics, archaeology, linguistics. Also respecting the big experts, sometimes slash egos. Overcoming nationalistic ideologies about dissent, and also, as you probably know, survive institutional reorganizations. So what I mean with reconciling different research traditions are practical things. For instance, geneticists love to publish their results in high impact journals, while there's a tradition in linguistics to put more value on books and reference works and chapters in books. There is also a different tradition of doctoral research. Linguists will produce a real book for their PhDs, while people in the sciences like geneticists often publish 3 big articles and sample them together, and they will have a PhD as well. So all these different traditions needed to be reconciled, and we needed to keep an open mind. Also, respecting the big experts. Of course, every field has its own expert, and every expert has its own views, and sometimes these views may clash. Nevertheless, I think we should keep an open mind there too. Listen to the experts, let it clash sometimes, and then search for common ground. My basic logic here was always, if two scholars disagree, then both of them might be right. And like that, we gradually searched for common ground. Overcoming nationalistic ideologies was also a challenge. Accepting that your own language and your own people and culture originated beyond the present day national boundaries of your territory is for some people a surrender of identity to which they are not yet prepared. So we had very strange situations. For example, colleagues in genetics asking our Chinese geneticists to withdraw the Korean and Japanese samples on the argumentation, how would you feel if we said similar things about the Chinese? So this kind of nationalistic argumentation should, of course, be avoided in scientific research. We should respect each other's feelings, but there is no room for nationalistic ideologies in science. And then finally, as you know, institutional reorganizations. When you are doing interdisciplinary research, please make sure that it does not depend too much on the context of your research institute. I had a hard time when the departments of genetics moved to Leipzig, and also a part of the linguistic department moved to Leipzig. But in the end, I survived with my research group, and I'm continuing happily as ever here in Jena. So if you feel ready to face all these challenges, then you might consider applying for a job at our Archaeolinguistic research group. Actually, we're currently recruiting for a full-time doctoral researcher in the field of historical comparative linguistics of the Trans-Eurasian languages. The position would be for 3 years, and that can be extended with 1 year eventually. If you are interested in applying, you can go to this URL, and if you have questions about the application, do not hesitate to contact me on this email address. So having said this, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you for your attention, and then we can maybe proceed to the discussion session.